Hello, good day and welcome to this session on probability and impact assessment of risk. By the end of this session, you should be able to explain the probability and assessment of risk. Risk, as we have explained in the previous session, is the likelihood or probability of an unwanted event occurring to a business. So in a supply chain relationship or in a typical procurement relationship or supply chain relationship, risk is the likelihood of any unwanted event with regard to goods or supplies or to the relationship itself occurring in the organization's interactions with their suppliers or customers. And in assessing risk or in determining whether a risk is high or low or having a moderate impact on the organization, you usually use probability and impact or consequences from the event so as to be able to determine the risk level in an organization's relationship. So risk is commonly assessed as a function of probability that an unwanted event will occur, which the event is usually an element of risk or a risk event occurring. And it's also assessed as a function of the resulting consequences or impact, which may be positive or negative. So basically, risk is a function of probability as well as impact or probability and consequence. So in order to find the risk level in a given activity, whether it's relationship or supply with environmental risk, it's usually calculated as probability of the event, which is multiplied by the consequence or impact of the risk event. So probability is usually the percentage likelihood of risk occurring, and impact is a number which ranges from 1 to 10, and usually 1 represents a small impact or consequence and 10 represents a huge impact or business threatening consequence or impact from the risk event. So in calculating risk levels in an organization using the function we saw earlier on, which is probability times impact or consequence, let's take the system's failure, which has a probability element of 20%, because we saw that probability is usually percentage likelihood and consequence is usually between 1 to 10. So systems failure has a likelihood of 20% occurring, and the consequences of that 20% is 10. So you realize that if you do not calculate the risk level, but you decide to take only the whole numbers, you might think that among the three elements of risk, that is systems failure, staff strike, and teething problems, the consequence for risk failure should lead to a high risk level if you take the whole values, because for the consequence we have systems failure to be the highest, which is 10, and then the lowest, which is teething problems, which is 5. And when you take the probability to, we have the highest, which being 80% for teething problems, and we have the lowest being for systems failure. But you cannot determine risk level by considering the whole numbers of the probability. Neither can you consider risk level by using the whole numbers of consequence. But you can only consider or find risk level by calculating the probability of the risk event and multiplying it by the consequence. So you take systems failure, its probability is 20% and its consequence is 10%. If you multiply 20% by 10%, you get risk level of 2. And for the staff strike, its probability is 30% and its consequence is 6%. So if you multiply 30% by 6%, you are getting a risk level of 3. And if you come to teasing problems, its probability is 80% and its consequence is 5%. And then the risk level is 4. So you realize that if you are given a threshold or the risk decision rule that values between 1 to 3 are given as low, values between 3 to let's say 7 are given as medium risk, and values above 7 are considered high risk. You realize if you had taken the whole numbers, you would have concluded that possibly either system's failure is the highest risk level given its consequence, or teething problem is the highest risk level given its probability. But you realize that after calculating the risk level, systems failure has the lowest risk level, and then staff strike follows as the second highest, and then teething problem has the highest risk level among the three. So we move on to the risk assessment grade. So the risk assessment grade helps to classify risks based on their impact and likelihood of occurring. So it classifies risk in terms of metrics A, B, C, and D. So let's have a detailed look of the risk assessment grid in the subsequent session. So for segment A, we have risks that have low likelihood and have low impact. So all the risks that are categorized in that segment, in order to tackle them, the action plan that the organization can take is to safely ignore those risks as or those factors or those risk elements as low priority, because in the end they have little probability or little chances of occurring, and if they do not have any impact on the organization. Then a typical example of such risks in segment A is the likelihood of a power outage. So for suppliers who have a lot of factories scattered across a given jurisdiction, one of the is a typical risk in segment A is where there is going to be a power outage in all the suppliers' factories, even though they have a backup generator at their factory. So it's not likely, it is less likely that all the suppliers' factories, maybe they have some in Ghana, maybe they have some in Tamale, they have some in Accra, they have some in Tema, they have some in Kumasi. It is of low likelihood that all the factories across the country will go off, and the impact will be low because the organization in the end has backup generators such that even if they go off, they will have power coming on immediately. So with these kind of risks, the organization will flag it as low priority and ignore it, because in the end it won't affect the organization and it has little chances of occurring. Then you move on to segment B, which is characterized by risks that have high likelihood but low impact. So there is a high chance that there would be exchange rate fluctuation in this current dispensation, where the CDM against the dollar, the the CD value keeps depreciating. It is a high likelihood that these events will occur, but it will have a low impact on the organization if the organization is not solely into international trade, or if it is not mainly into international trade. Exchange rate fluctuation will never affect the organization. So for such factors, the organization has to closely monitor them in case there changes and the impact will affect the organization directly. So segment C is characterized or contains risks that have high impact but are of a low likelihood of occurring. And this is a typical risk is where a supplier of a very critical item fails to supply the items needed by an organization. Even though when there is proper relationship management, this event or this risk element is less likely to occur. But assuming such an event is supposed to occur, the impact on the organization will be very drastic, because for critical suppliers, they supply highly valuable items to the organization. So if they are to fail in their supply activities, it's going to cause an organization significant loss. And then finally, we have the segment D, which is characterized by risks typical of high risk and high likelihood and high impact. So an example is where an organization operates in a highly technological environment where new and advanced technology keep emerging. The likelihood of a competitor introducing a new technology is high, and the impact on the organization is that it is going to outdate whatever the organization used to adopt in their system. So the organization would consider such a risk as a high risk and respond to them by including it in its strategic analysis and planning, because such a risk is likely to affect the organization in the long term. So in this session, we have learned about the probability and assessment of risk, as well as discussed the risk assessment grid.